All right, y'all, let's go ahead and get started. So hi, I'm Dan Castillo. I'm part of marketing here at Agility, and I'm going to be your webinar support today. So just a few things. I mentioned earlier that we are going to record this webinar, so don't worry if you have to hop. We understand life happens. We will send you a recording after this session. And then another thing is if you have questions that pop up during this webinar, please go ahead and drop them in the little Q&A section, and we will get to them towards the end of this webinar during our Q&A session. All right. So I am actually going to go ahead and hand it off to your wonderful hosts today, Allison, Wyatt, and Jonathan Howard, to get us started. All right.
Great. Thanks, Dane. I will now share my screen. We'll jump in.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited. Jonathan and I are just thrilled to be here and giving you some insights into how you can be ready for your next leader. My name is Allison Wyatt. I'm a managing partner and co-founder of Agility Consulting. I've spent about 20 years in the talent management, leadership development, and executive search space. Worked across the nonprofit, for-profit, and social impact spaces. And just I'm really excited to share some of the things that we have learned and built and sort of are excited to disseminate with you all today.
And I'm Jonathan Howard. I'm an associate partner here at Agility. Been with Agility a little over 2 years, but creeping close to about 20 years of professional experience, mostly in the talent recruitment space. So likewise, I'm excited to have this conversation with you all. And I also just wanted to reiterate, like, please put questions in the chat. Like, you know, we want this to be interactive, or raise your hand, right? So yeah, just definitely want to hear your voices as we have this discussion. So thank you all for being here.
Excellent. Well, I will kick us off. Just for those of you who might not be familiar with Agility, we thought it would be helpful to give you a sense of the lens we bring to this conversation and the work we do. And, you know, I think Agility really exists to ensure that organizations that are really committed to equity in the social impact space are equipped with the right leaders and the right talent systems so that they can live out their values internally as well for the staff that they work with. So our firm is all about ensuring that we're placing equity-minded leaders and helping them build equity-centered systems so that we can close wage and opportunity gaps for particularly women and for staff of color. And so, you know, just to give you a glimpse into how we do that work, we have a variety of services we offer, from our executive search practice, which is really focused on, you know, placing leaders that are representative of the populations that they serve. We also do transition support for leaders as they are entering into new roles, and for boards as they're thinking about preparing for going through that process and then onboarding a new leader. Our consulting practice works with organizations to design compensation programs that will close any wage gaps that may exist in those organizations and then help them throughout the process of implementing those programs. And they also help to redesign all of the talent systems in their organization to ensure that everybody's having a fair chance and an equal opportunity to have a really fulfilling career, to advance their career in the organization, and to feel really welcome and included in their culture. And we work with a broad array of organizations across the sector and across the country. This is just a sample of some of the organizations that we've worked with recently. But, you know, Agility, we're working probably with over 150, 200 clients a year. So we see a lot of really interesting trends and just have a lot of data about sort of what, you know, organizations are doing, what's working, what's not. So I'm actually going to go ahead and hand it over to Jonathan so he can preview, you know, some of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, real brief agenda. Want to stay focused on a couple of things, keep conversation focused on a couple of things. So the first is we want to talk about building your bench and to help you start thinking about who's on your team and how you can develop those folks. And then the second piece is building your pipeline. In the case that you do need to go external and find a leader, want you to start thinking strategically about how to do that. So first, we wanted to just give you an overview of the key functions that we think a board should have. First and foremost, as a board member, your job is to hire, support, and evaluate the leader of your organization, right? Like that is first and foremost. And hopefully you have someone amazing in that seat right now. But as we'll talk about shortly, you need to have an eye toward the future and always be thinking ahead of what's coming next for your organization, what's coming next for your leader and your leadership team. Next is fiscal stewardship. Making sure that the books are good and things are running smoothly. Ensuring strategic sustainability and impact. What's the mission of the organization, right? You want to make sure that your organization is meeting that. The board also, is there to fill gaps in expertise, right? Maybe you have some kind of skill set that can be valuable. Maybe it's legal, maybe a finance background that you can bring to the table to help support the organization and the leadership team. And then finally, just networking, connecting, making connections for folks, to the organization. And if applicable, if you're a nonprofit organization, you're probably doing some fundraising as well. So, like I said, like I mentioned, you need to be thinking ahead, right? So it's not just about today. You really have to be thinking about tomorrow, and making sure that you're thinking about how you are building the team, who are in what seats, are they the right people, what development do they need, and you need to be thinking about what's plan B. What's plan B if your leader leaves? What's plan B if key folks decide for whatever reason decide to exit your organization? So we are really want you to just be thinking about taking the long view and really looking ahead to what's next. So part of that is one thing that we recommend, and we actually have a tool for this that we'll share with you all at the end. But is to do a needs assessment, right? Like really thinking about like who you are as a board, who you are as an organization, like what are the gaps, right? What do you need now? What do you need in the future? And so, that's where we would start. The second piece is what is your value proposition, right? Like, are you positioned to attract who you need, right? In our work, unfortunately, right, part of our job is to really get an understanding of like what of the organizations we're working with, right? What's going well? What are the growth areas, right? And sometimes those growth areas are places that if the word on the street is that your organization has like this challenge, right? It may be something that is going to prohibit you from attracting and being able to hire the best people to push your organization forward. Where should you be fortifying the organization? That comes out of the needs assessment. And then, as always, my sort of mantra as a recruiter is always be recruiting, right? As a board member, you should always be, cultivating relationships. Again, making introductions to folks, just to make sure that you have those relationships in place if you need them today or in the future.
And Joho, I don't know about you, but I know I find with clients sometimes, they're just starting to have these conversations when they launch a search, right? And Agility comes in and starts to do that needs assessment. And I like to liken it to preparing for selling to sell your house. Like if you're waiting for the inspection to find out what you need to do to get your house ready for sale, like that's too late, right? And so I just so agree with Joho that this should be happening regularly and early, so that if there are issues, you can course correct and fix those and really make sure your organization is like delivering on its promise currently, but also setting you up to be attractive for when that moment occurs.
Absolutely. Thanks, Allison. The next piece, again, in our work, right, these are sort of the especially in the nonprofit space, these are the big functions that we see leaders, CEOs, EDs, and leadership teams taking on. So raising revenue to fund operations, that's always a big piece, especially in the nonprofit world. Actually just managing the operations, back office, finance, that piece, making sure the lights stay on, if you will. Providing programmatic leadership. So what is the actual work, what is the actual work that you're doing as an organization? And certainly not last, probably should be first on the list. It's a leader's job to build a thriving organization or culture that's going to be a place that people want to work and is attractive to folks. You have to, as a board member, right, like you have to so first sort of understand what the roles and responsibilities are, like we get really clear on that, starting with your leader, but also like really you should be talking to that leader and like really asking and try to understand what the other leaders on the team are doing, right? And it's your job to know that and like help that person start thinking about and have the conversation about succession planning, right? So whether that person's going to be in the seat for another year, 5 years, 10 years, or what's the some, God forbid, something happens, an emergency situation happens, like you need to be thinking about that and having that conversation now, right? And like really, as a board, you need to be thinking about it for your ED CEO, but you also need to go, if applicable, it depends on sort of the organization, really go down to those different layers, figure out like who's on the bus, who's on the team, what are their skill sets, what are their strengths, are there growth areas, is there a way, who's our number two, right? Is there a way to give that person, growth opportunities, development opportunities, so that they're growing those skills, so that when the time comes, you've been proactively building that bench and making sure people are ready.
Great.
So yeah, Allison.
Yeah, no, so I think that Jonathan and I are so curious to get a sense of sort of across these different elements where your organization is. So you're going to see a poll that just give us a sense of, if your leader were to leave today unexpectedly, would your organization be set up to meet its fundraising goals, right? And we're going to share the results in just a moment.
I don't know how long to give people. We have there's a few of these questions. So Dane,
we have 4 questions. So yeah, finger to the wind answers, right?
Dane, you want to give me just a green light to move to the next one once you see a bunch of votes in there?
We're almost there. We've got a lot of great participation. I'll give you guys just to the minute mark here, and then we'll close the poll. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, y'all. I'm going to end that poll.
Awesome. And then similarly, how would you be set on the operations front? Like if your leader left today, would your organizational operations just run seamlessly? Would the train stay on the tracks? From a finance and just an, admin, HR, tech, ops perspective?
Awesome, y'all. Keep those answers coming in.
I promise we only have 4 of these, so you're almost halfway there.
All right, almost there. Just a few more seconds here, so get your answers in. Awesome. All right, thank y'all.
All right, so number 3, you know, do you have a strong number 2? You know, if your leader were to leave, is there somebody internal that you think is at least 75% of the way there, so that they could pretty seamlessly step into that role and pretty quickly be developed into the leader you need?
All right, just waiting for a few more answers here and then we'll close the poll. So please go ahead and choose your A, B, or C, yes, no, or I don't know. Getting some good numbers in here. So I think you'll be excited about this, Allison and Jonathan.
You can't wait to see.
All right, gonna go ahead and close
One
this
more.
poll.
And then the last one is just thinking about, you know, your program and your impact. If your leader were to leave unexpectedly, you know, would your programs continue to really seamlessly be able to deliver their impact?
Now we got a couple more seconds here. I'm waiting for a few more people to answer. Thank you all so much for participating in these polls. We love to see your answers here. All right, gonna go ahead and close this here in just a moment. All right, thank you all so much.
Excellent.
And I'll wait until I see the, there we go. All right. We're updating this in real time. Oh, no, I think I have to refresh because it's not showing up.
Oh, there we go. There's the numbers.
There we go. All right.
Nobody answered. So really interesting. I mean, it looks like operations and programs are, you know, in the strongest position for the organizations here, and where you're feeling like you may be at risk is more around the fundraising and just, do you really have somebody who is ready to take the helm? And I think that this is not honestly particularly unique to what we see in working with clients. I mean, Jonathan, I would be really curious to hear your take on this as well. But my sense in working with clients is that there's a lot of focus on programs and there's a lot of focus on operations, and that oftentimes organizations talk about how important a succession plan is. But, you know, I would say as a sector, we tend to have underdeveloped talent management, professional development practices. And so it's pretty rare actually for what an executive search to lead to an internal placement. And I think it's pretty rare that somebody has somebody in the wings. And of course, a lot of times, particularly for small to medium-sized nonprofits, the ED is doing all the fundraising, right? So that's a particularly vulnerable area if that person had to transition unexpectedly. Jonathan, do you have other insights?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think usually when folks are talking to us, right, it's because, you know, they abruptly found out that they have a leadership transition pending, right, and they need to find somebody, right? And so really, like, what this is all about for us is, like, I really want to find a way to just engage earlier, right? Like, yeah, we should be talking at least a year. Like you should know when your transitions are happening, or at least have an idea of a timeline, and you should be talking to potential partners, potential search partners about that a year plus in advance. So the fact that you're here now is a good sign, because you're starting to think about it.
100%. Yeah. And I think that, the reason why we hope that our clients will be thinking about that with so much foresight is that a lot of the work that needs to happen takes time. When we think about, okay, if you're thinking that you could have a leadership transition in 1, 2, 3 years, even 5 years, there's things you should be doing right now. You should be looking at your organizational structure and making sure that you have a pipeline of roles that people can grow through up to the very top. And that takes time. Sometimes that can take, 2 to 3 years. I know we do a lot of career pathways work with clients and org dev work with clients. And oftentimes those changes are phased. It's not something you're just going to do overnight. So it's never too early to start thinking about what type of an organizational structure do I need to build so that my people are kind of growing and moving at a reasonable rate, and getting that experience and building that knowledge so that they are accumulating the type of skills they need over time to be ready for future transitions. And you can do that even without formalized structures. You can give people stretch opportunities. You can develop strategic professional development plans even within their current roles, right? And start to give them training experience as well, so that you're building their knowledge and helping them get the skills they need in order to be able to be ready for those moves. And then ultimately, I think too, programmatically, it looks like 2/3 of you had, felt pretty confident in sort of a seamless transition of like programmatic operations and impact. So programmatically, oftentimes there is like a plan for that. But if you're feeling like, wow, I'm actually in that third bucket of, I'm not sure we do have a plan for who would, be able to carry that forward, then you want to really make sure you're building out that plan for it now, because that's ultimately the core to why the organization exists. And you don't want to have there be any, you don't want to miss a beat in that arena, especially.
And then, if you have a good succession plan in place and you have a person ready, that's great, right? But again, like our experience is that it's just often just not the case. And even if you do, right, like sometimes just depending on the context of your organization, people's history with the organization, right? Like it's probably a good idea to do a search, an external search, and bring in external folks along with the internal people that might be interested, right? So we definitely recommend like really thinking about like what it means to promote somebody internally, and if it is a good idea to bring other folks in. So what does it take? We've been talking about this, right? Like we really have to understand like what the situation is and what the needs are. Again, I'm always going to be talking about like constantly connecting, right? Like it's not about cheating on your leader, right? Like by having conversations and building relationships, right? Like your job as a board member is first and foremost, your responsibility is first and foremost to the organization, and it's your job to really be thinking about those things and building those relationships. And then the last piece is like thinking about who can help, right? And certainly, agility, this is what we do. We can help. Like, I would absolutely, welcome a conversation if there's a need. But I'd also say like talk to others as well, right? Don't just talk to one firm. Just wanted to kind of give you all just some things you should be thinking about, right? So just an example of a funnel. Like if you are doing a search, this is what it would look like. This is a typical funnel for like an executive level search for us, right? Started with sourcing, doing video and phone interviews, moving people through a process, working with a search committee to make sure we're vetting people appropriately and moving people along a process. Another thing to think about is reach, right? Like, are you really looking for a firm that has a broad reach, or are you looking for someone that's super hyper local and like really knows your city or your market well? And so Agility, we're a national firm, and we have folks all over the country, and we work with organizations all over the country. And so we would be the former of that list, but something you should be thinking about as you're looking for partners. Also, another good question to ask is network, right? So if you have an ED search, like, hey, what kind of network do you have? Like, how many like ED level people have you engaged with or are in your networks, right? And so this, just some quick examples of just our folks that are in the Agility network as an example. And then results too, right? Like, it's also appropriate, and you should absolutely want to know what kind of results your potential partners are achieving. So, we're, Allison early on sort of mentioned in the who we are and what we care about, but we have a focus on increasing access to people of color, to women, to folks from other marginalized groups, to get them access to these opportunities. And again, a lot of the organizations we're serving are working with constituents, students, partners who identifies these things too, right? Another thing is how long are folks staying in their roles too, is another question that you should absolutely be asking potential partners. And just to bring it all back to that question early on that we talked about how attractive you are, right? Like, really, the board assessment, which we'll share in a second, the board needs assessment, which we'll share in a second. That's where it starts, right? You really have to figure out, like, are you in a place as a board, as an organization, that's going to be a place that is really attractive, right? And so, what's the makeup of your board? Do you understand the difference between governance and management, right? If you are in the position to bring someone new on, like, how well are you positioned right now to support that person, to make sure that person gets onboarded effectively so that they can lead the work, and then that those numbers that we saw, the 29% for the fundraising, and I forget what the other one was, but that those percentages increase as you are looking for new leadership.
Yeah, and I would just double click on, the internal candidate question. I think that, doing these assessments is actually a great retention strategy for your current leader, right? Because, sometimes leaders leave because of issues that are happening at the board level, and they want to kind of, have a board that's more supportive, or a board that's more involved in fundraising, or whatever the case may be, right? So sometimes issue spotting can actually prevent that turnover. I think, Jonathan, you also mentioned just, it's so important to do a search regardless of whether or not you have an internal candidate. I think that actually it's interesting, because I think a lot of times people think about a search and they just think about, finding people, and really it's so much more than that. It's building buy-in for the person who gets placed. It's paving the way for a successful transition and onboarding plan. And without it, you really risk, when I've seen internal candidates fail, it's been less because they haven't been prepared, and more because people have only seen them in their current role, and they haven't been given an opportunity to sort of engage with the full community and really meet all the relevant stakeholders and show what they could do at this new level. So, it's always, I think people want to see that there was a robust process and a really, you really sort of ran a competitive search, regardless of whether there's somebody internal or not. So I'm just going to preview that we have a tool that, we'll share with you to do that board assessment and kind of get a sense of, where your board is in terms of its readiness for a search, its attractiveness to external candidates, it's, you know, and even just sort of understanding how you are currently, and Dane will share, you know, more details about how to access that. But really, it's going to help you look at, you know, how effectively your board works together as a team, how effective your board is around making, you know, clear decision making and having really good protocols around that. How effective of a decision-making body is it? Is it really, does your board really understand its role? And is it really effective at carrying out the responsibilities that we talked about, right? You know, and I think the other thing is, like, a lot of times organizations come to us, you know, because of our track record and success around, you know, placing women and placing leaders of color, and they're really committed to diversifying their leadership team. But their board isn't diverse. And so, you know, it looks at the demographics of your board too, because if that's what you want to build internally in your organization, that's what you need to be building first and foremost at the board level. So there's a lot of different, you know, angles that it looks at sort of your current state. And it just helps you get a sense of, you know, overall, how do you compare? And then where should you be focusing, regardless of where you are on that journey, in order to get your board to the next level. So definitely recommend, you know, it's something you can facilitate as a board all together, and certainly even something you could do with your ED or your CEO, but definitely recommend, you know, taking some time to do that exercise. So I want to make sure we also save a little bit of time for questions that may have come up over the course of the conversation. So I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions in the chat.
Yeah, y'all, there's a couple ways you can ask us questions if things are coming up for you. You can drop them in the Q&A, you can drop them in the chat, or if you prefer to vocalize your question, you can go ahead and select raise hand, and I can go ahead and unmute you. In the meantime, you can go ahead and access that board assessment tool by scanning that QR code with your phone, or you can use the link that I dropped in the chat. Allison and Jonathan, like, what are some like really common questions that come up? Probably if you could think on like the first or second question that you always hear in regards to this issue. What is that question? Kind of like, how do I do this, or how do I convince my leadership team to create a succession plan?
I think so. I mean, a lot of times it's like, how do I approach my leader about the conversation, right? Like, you know, like without like them feeling sort of like they're, you know, that their job is at stake, right? And like, depending on what their like sort of what the performance is, right? Like just being able to have that like real conversation. Like if someone's struggling in a role and like the board really is thinking about making a change, right? Like, how do you approach that conversation, right? And I often am having that conversation, trying to help folks navigate that.
Awesome. And I think that one thing that can be helpful is starting to think about internally in the organization, you know, asking your leader, like, what is the succession plan for your leadership team, right? And that opens up that dialogue around sort of starting to think about that, you know, that growth plan, and to get them thinking about it. And then it's kind of a natural extension from that too, so that it's not, like, to Jonathan's point, a really threatening conversation. Hopefully you have a good relationship. Hopefully you're having that conversation, you know, every year, sort of about the future and what the plans are. But, you know, I think that you want to be bringing those things up when the stakes are really low and there's not like a transition on the table, right?
Yeah, Allison, I think you kind of answered this a little bit, but we had a question from Tammy that asked kind of like, what is the timeline on creating a succession plan? And does this include promotional pathways for the org?
Yeah. I think ideally you want 3 years. You know, I think that unless you have somebody locked and loaded and ready to go, you know, usually when you're trying to develop skills at that leadership level, it takes time, right? It's not a technical skill that somebody's going to pick up in a couple of months. It's something they're going to have to get exposure to, observe, practice, get more and more responsibility over the course of, you know, a sustained period of time. So for me, I would say you would want at least 3 years to really, you know, minimum 2 years to think about that timeline. Sometimes you don't have that luxury, right? So you work with whatever you have, obviously, but if you have that luxury, I would definitely just not kick that can down the road. And I just think it's so common that organizations don't start thinking about it until it's too late. So if you have that luxury, I would just take advantage of it and make sure that you're, you know, paving that path. Because one thing that I will say that we do see sometimes when organizations haven't done that is you can actually lose key members of your leadership team because they feel frustrated. You know, they feel like, why wasn't I given an opportunity? Why wasn't I developed and given sort of the chance to grow into this role? So, you know, I think that's the other risk to not doing it early is it can be demotivating for your internal leaders who might have actually been really aspiring for that position ultimately.
Yeah, I think that actually goes really well into our next question, which is if you have a strong number 2, but still want to do a search, how would you include that person in the search?
Great question. Thanks, Christina. I mean, we always recommend that everyone goes through, for the sake of equity, like that everyone goes through the same process, right? And so whether they're internal or external, and so that's, you know, I think for the internal person, right, you do want to have a conversation and sort of, you know, like, does the person have a real shot, right? Like, and if not, like, let's just have that conversation up front. And, you know, so hopefully you have talent systems and evaluation systems that are strong and folks, you know where they stand and what their growth area, what their strengths and growth areas are. But sometimes in a lot of cases, right, those aren't there, right? And so I think there's a conversation that needs to happen with the number 2 person, but then once you sort of mutually decide that it's, you know, makes sense for them to move forward, then they should go through the same process that any candidate would go through.
Thanks, Joe.
And the other piece of that too, right, is like, depending on the context, right, do they want people knowing that they're applying, right? But do they want their colleagues knowing, right? And you know, my thoughts on that are generally, yeah, there comes a stage once we get to a finalist round, it's going to be public, right? And so you can't really keep it a secret, but early stages, right, you can, right? And so I always tell the internal candidate, like, you know, it's up to you, but like, I recommend you not sharing that you're an applicant at this stage. And so that's another piece to think about as well.
Yeah, and the only other piece to that, I mean, Jonathan, I don't know about you, but I would typically recommend that they aren't part of the evaluation of other candidates, obviously, if they're an actual contender for the search. So you kind of want to build a wall between them and the process. You know, they shouldn't be on the search committee, clearly.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be interviewing other candidates. I mean, you'd be surprised sometimes, you know, orgs want ask about that. And you really want to make sure that it's very clear that until they are not, you know, like if they, at any point, if they are no longer part of that process, then they're not a candidate anymore. And instead they're a critical direct report who should be involved in the process. But, you know, while their hat is still in the ring, you need to really separate them from it.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question. Can you both talk a little bit about the kind of the separation of or where talent management is versus creating a succession plan and where they cross over?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jonathan spoke a little bit to this or alluded a little bit to kind of the type of talent management systems that you want to have in order to be able to inform a succession plan. So you have to be able to answer some very basic questions, right? What does it take to succeed in these different roles in the organization? And where are the people in those roles? Are they exceeding? Are they succeeding? Are they not performing? And then you start to think about, okay, so for the people who are exceeding, right, are they ready to take on more? And do we have a plan for them to grow internally into those seats? And for the people who are performing, how do we sort of continue to invest and develop them, right, in their current role to, grow and be, excelling and be ready for promotion, essentially be promotion ready. And then, of course, for the folks that are not performing, are there ways we can support them to help them be successful, or are they not the right person for the role? So, first and foremost, I think organizations need to think about their performance management system, performance evaluations, goal setting, making sure that you really have a tight process around that. And if that's something your organization doesn't have, I'm not sure succession planning can really work well, because you open the door to lots of bias and you open the door to lots of subjective data. So that would be the first step I would take, is make sure you have really clear expectations at each level for each role. You have, really clear goals, and you have a really strong evaluation system to just know where people are and for them to be able to know where they are too. And that's work that we do all the time through our talent equity consulting practice. And then, if you have that, then I think the second piece is really having career pathways in the organization, so people can kind of see what the runway is, and you understand what the runway is, and it's logically built. So, sometimes organizations create jobs just based on who's on the bus or the work that needs to get done. And if you're going to do true succession planning, you start to add another lens to that, and you create career pathways where you're building in responsibilities that prepare people to get to the next level, little micro steps along the way. So it's like scaffolding. And I think a lot of times organizations don't think about structure from that lens. So again, that's something that, you can do internally, that a firm like Agility could help you with, any sort of talent consulting expert. But you need to sort of have that thoughtful plan. And then I think after that, those two pieces are what feeds into a succession strategy. Then you can start to understand where you have pools, where you have gaps, and build a plan to fill those things.
Fantastic. Thank you, Allison. We have another question that came in. How do you handle a case where the existing CEO has a strong internal preference, but the board wants to look more broadly?
That's a great question. I mean, the first piece is, right, especially if this is if it is the, replacement for that CEO, right? Like, you have to just be really clear that, who the decision maker is, right? In this case, or in most cases, it's the board, right? And so just having that conversation, and just being upfront with them about, what the board is looking for, and even potentially having a conversation about the current candidate, right? Like, again, like there might, or the internal preference, the person who's preferred, right? Talking about their strengths and weaknesses, and how those things align with the board, and like if appropriate, right? Like indicating excitement about the person, but also just being clear about what the organization needs and what you'd be trying to find externally, right? So that's the first piece. I think the second piece is, just being really careful and thoughtful about like how the current CEO is involved, right? Like, that person probably shouldn't be a part of the search committee. Certainly, at some point in the process, would want that person to have some engagement with candidates, and not interview them, but really more so for the candidate's sake, to just get their perspective, sort of like where they've what they see happening in the organization, and getting and collecting their feedback too, right? So like, it's important to it is important to get that person's perspective, right? And like, but just being clear about like, hey, we do want your perspective, but ultimately we are going to take all of the feedback and input we get from various stakeholder groups and use that as part of our decision-making process as a board.
Awesome. we have one more question. Can you talk about what you've seen in your experiences where a sitting board member takes over in an acting CEO role? So pros and cons, challenges, wins that that organization faced.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's definitely happened. I'm trying to remember the situation. Yeah, Allison, have you ever experienced that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, we see current staff sit in the role on an interim basis. We see interims, we've seen board members. I would say it's a little bit less common for us to see a board member come in and sit in. And I think the risk, so pros are, they know the organization extremely well, right? They know the ED extremely well. So there is an element of like, they're able to understand the context, and they're not like an external interim who has to come in and get the lay of the land. I think the con is that we've had situations where it's been very difficult for that board member to then step away, right? So as you all know, board members really should not be involved in day-to-day operations. So like if that person's taking an interim role, they should step down from the board. They should be in that role. And then after the position is filled, then they could go back and serve on the board of directors, but they shouldn't be playing both roles at once. It's like trying to play Monopoly against yourself. It gets too messy, right? And I think it's even hard for people, in all honesty. I've seen a lot of situations when I have seen that happen where, the board member it really struggles to really go back into that seat as board member. They have really close relationships with staff. It's easy for staff to come to them, and it can just create some strange dynamics. So I think if that happens, I think that you need to be like, that person needs to be very good at respecting the guardrails of those two positions and not trying to cross over and take advantage of the fact that they have sort of special relationships on both sides.
Thank you so much, Allison. I haven't seen any other questions come in. Oh, yes. Yahara? Apologies if I'm misspelling or mispronouncing your name. Mentioned I was somewhere that lost their ED before opening up. Yahira. Okay. Apologies. Before opening shop and a board member took on the role. Yeah.
It can get really messy. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? I think we have time for maybe one more. But if you do have to hop, just thank you so much for spending the time here with us today. We'll go ahead and send out a follow-up email with all this information and that tool we shared. Before you go, if you could please just go ahead and take our survey and just let us know how we did. If this was helpful information, it's really great for us to know. So thank you again. Looks like we did have one question come in. Thank you so much. So our last question of the day is going to be, how have you seen organizations handle overlap between outgoing and incoming CEOs?
One thing that I always talk about, early on in the search is like, what is the plan for onboarding the new person, right? Like, what's the timeline for the current person? Again, it's going to vary depending on the situation, right? But like, if things are, if it's sort of like a positive like transition, right? And like the current person's able to stay on for a little bit to sort of like help onboard that person. Like it really depends on the situation, right? But like the key is, in addition to doing a search, right? Like it is a good idea, and like I do recommend and talk to boards about like also doing like a separate like onboarding transition plan that includes everything from like messaging, like how are we messaging this transition, how are we announcing the new person, are we going to invest in a coach for the new person to help them through their first 6 months to just learn the organization, learn the role, right? And so Yeah, like that's, those are some things that I encourage folks to think about. And we also like offer that as a sort of add-on, if folks do want to work with agility to help help coach the new person as they onboard. But yeah, it's not just like hire somebody, or it shouldn't be just hire somebody, old person leaves, new person starts, and then everything's gonna be good. Like if you don't have a good onboarding transition plan, you're setting the person up for failure.
Absolutely. All right, I think I don't see any other questions come in, but don't worry if you didn't get your question and it comes up later, feel free to email us, let us know. Like I said, we will send that follow-up email, and there will be a link in there so you can book time with Jonathan and ask him all of your questions, succession planning, etc. So yeah, thank you all so much for spending this time with us. We all know how important succession planning is, so it means a lot that you are here with us and learning this. And yeah, take our survey and stay tuned for more webinars coming up later this year. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.